All right. Kia ora koutou. Ko Anjum Rahman tuku ingoa. I am a facilitator here working at Tāhono Trust, and we're an organisation that works on building belonging and inclusion through community development, education, advocacy, and a few other activities. For the purposes of today, we're working with Amnesty International Aotearoa New Zealand on the No Harm We campaign, where we're advocating for platform regulation at a systems and design level rather than individual pieces of content level. And that is similar to online safety legislation in the EU, UK, Ireland, Canada, and Australia. The link to our website will be appearing in the chat, so keep an eye on that. This is the second webinar in our No Harmware webinar series, and the link to the first webinar will be in the chat as well. The first one focused on the international perspective, where we had international experts give their views on the benefits and pitfalls of platform regulation. Today's webinar focuses on Indigenous perspectives, and I'll be introducing our wonderful speakers shortly. Please do watch out for our third webinar. The date is yet to be confirmed, and that one will focus on the experience of regulators. As a reminder, the government has released its report on the Youth Online Harm Inquiry with recommendations that are in line with what we're advocating for, including an independent regulator, product liability, and algorithmic transparency. Just a little bit of housekeeping. As this is a webinar, your camera and mic won't be working, and the chat function isn't open for participants. There will be a question and answer session at the end after the speakers have spoken. So please do drop your questions into the Q&A. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can. Let me now introduce the speakers in no particular order. Ana McAllister, Te Aitanga Mahaki, has a background in internet policy, specialising in culturally responsive, community-centred approaches to counter online harm. With experience in providing technical, cultural and policy guidance, she bridges the needs of government and grassroots communities to address the digital needs of Aotearoa. Ana's expertise spans technical knowledge of internet infrastructure on a local and global scale, supporting her advocacy for an open, secure online landscape that honours human rights. Jodan Perry is a Warami man from Karua, a storyteller, journalist, and now a lecturer at the University of Newcastle. He spent 12 years in the Australian broadcast media, leading both news and current affairs and digital teams. He now teaches students about the industry from his experience and is researching how Indigenous knowledge systems can guide how we live with emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. Chris Cormack, who's Kaitahu Katimamoe Waitaha, works as Kaihua Waire Matihiko at Catalyst IT and also works as a digital technician at Te Kahura Raunga. A long-time advocate of Māori data sovereignty, and he works in the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and technology. So we're going to begin with each speaker giving some introductory remarks, and I'm going to start with you, Chris, if that's okay.
Tēnā tātou, ka nui te koe i roto i taku ngaka ki te kiti kia koutou, kua hui mai nei ki te whakangongo, ki te kōrerururu i ngā take, e take tino rangati, well, tino, kari au muhi the word more important, it's just slipped my mind. But anyway, I'm just saying, it's good to see so many of you here to discuss this important topic around harm online and what we can do about it. As Anjum mentioned, I've got a couple of jobs. Also, I forgot to mention in my bio, is I also am part of the Māori Advisory Panel for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner as well. So I've got a little bit of another lens in there as well. I think that's enough from me to start with. I'll hand it back to Anjum to pass over to whoever else.
Thanks. I'll pass over to you, Jodan.
Weeaboo. My name's Jodan Perry. As Anjum mentioned, I'm a Warramai man. My family are from Kurua, which is a Aboriginal community about 45 minutes north of Newcastle in New South Wales here in Australia. I guess I was very excited that Anjum reached out to do this, as I'll go a little bit further on in the chat. Online harm towards Indigenous journalists is a massive issue in this country, and even further, all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as well. And it actually played a really large part in why I left my old career, and now I'm looking at the industry and from the outside. So, looking forward to talking a bit more as we go on.
Thank you. And Anna.
Kia ora. Thank you, Anjum. Kia ora, everyone. I just will prefix today by saying that I work at Internet NZ as the Community Engagement and Public Policy Manager. However, the opinions that I offer today are that of my own and not my employer. I'm very excited to be here in this korero today. I have a background in grassroots activism in terms of far-right content creators, which I'll talk about a bit later. Super passionate about both the important and powerful role that tech and the internet can play in our lives, as well as the very real risks brought on by the internet in our ever increasingly digital world. Bit of a nerd for legislation and regulation, so also very excited to talk about that today. Kia ora.
Oh, thank you. So let's get into it. We'll start with you, Jodan. What has been the experience of Indigenous communities in Australia during the Voice campaign when there was no regulation in place?
Yeah, okay. So I guess ever since we've had social media, obviously we've always copped a barrage of racist crap online. The Voice referendum was a pretty big turning point over here, I felt. There was kind of like a timeline of things that kept increasing in intensity. And it all started when we had the Black Lives Matter moment after the George Floyd got murdered and newsrooms started taking a look at themselves. We had COVID at the same time, and we started to see like large scale misinformation and racism around those kind of things. But once we had this voice referendum proposal, where it was compulsory for everyone that lived in Australia to vote, it really became how we felt was a vote on us as people very, very quickly, and the rhetoric and the commentary devolved really, really quickly. So I worked at NITV, National Indigenous Television at the time, and I was running the digital team. And there was just massive amounts of racism on not just our content, that there was every single piece of content we did about the voice referendum. It went viral with racism. We had to keep turning the comments off and limiting our engagement, which went against our KPIs, and it also limited the reach that some of these good stories from our perspectives we were doing will actually get. So there was plenty of factors at play, but there was a lot of misinformation, racism, the political sphere. There was just reporters jumping over the top of each other to do the latest story and get the latest soundbite of any political figure talking about the voice. There was overload, and it was just everywhere. And I guess the biggest things I found was Indigenous reporters that worked on the front lines found it really, really tough. It was a really toxic time. And Lorena Allam, who's a professor at UTS Sydney, actually said a quote was like, we've been unavoidably exposed on a daily basis to some of the worst depictions of our people. We've received racist threats and hate each time we publish a story, worried about fairly representing the wide views of our communities, but also at the same time calling out lies and misinformation. It was like a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. No sooner you put resources into destroying some lies, more would pop up, and there'd be racism at the same time. So it was a very, very, very toxic time. And I guess I could go on about this forever. I kind of got to wrap it up. But a big key we did at NITV is we actually left Twitter after Elon Musk took over. We found that the algorithm just produced racism and hate nonstop, and I didn't want any of my staff to see it. So we decided to pull the plug. And we also did other strategies like getting our Facebook inbox automated, so other members of staff who are non-Indigenous had to vet that. So we found a couple of ways that we could get away from a lot of the racism as journalists. But all in all, things have been increasing in violent rhetoric and hate since then, and there's been studies that have shown that since the referendum.
Thanks, Jodan. I'll move on to you, Chris. Have you seen anything similar here impacting tangata whenua?
I guess not essentially, not to the same extent. I think the Voice campaign in Australia was kind of the first massive scale one that I've seen in terms of, and just how vitriolic and how unavoidable. Like even living over here, it was dominating our news feeds and our algorithms and that kind of thing as well. I guess probably the closest in kind of recent history would be the Treaty Principles Bill and the way that mobilized, again, as Jodan mentioned, a lot of disinformation and a lot of misinformation and quite well funded organizations setting out to muddy the water, to promote disharmony, to undo some of the work that's been done here over the last 10, 15 years to bridge kind of understanding between Māori and non-Māori, undoing a lot of that. And again, playing out not just in the social media, but in mainstream media as well, who often will pick up and repeat this disinformation or misinformation without challenge, without any kind of basic fact checking or common sense in some examples that can't possibly be true. On the upside, it did mobilize, the social media also mobilized the biggest hikoi I've seen in my memory. It was massive. I think whatever numbers the media reported were massively under what were actually there. I was at Parliament and the tail still hadn't left the end of Courtenay Place. It was still by the embassy. So that's a long way. That's a lot of people, and we weren't spread out. We were packed in there. So there's I guess that was the good side of social media being used, but it was. And the other thing is the week of Waitangi every year. It's pretty much the best time to just disengage from social media and media in general, because we get the same old tropes every year around Waitangi Day. Probably, and I think Jodan touched on it too, was with things like Twitter, the algorithm does promote and it does reward those opinions that get outrage, they get, they're kind of that clickbait of hate, but that filters through to Instagram and filters through to other platforms too. So you get rewarded by engagement, and engagement doesn't have to be good engagement. It doesn't have to be people commenting in a good way. It can be promoting outrage and annoying people is actually the kind of opposite, often the best way to make engagement and to get money do that. So I think as more and more people are online and more of their life is spent online, that stuff seeps into your daily life more and more. Okay, I think that's enough of me.
Thank you. Ana, I know that you have experiences of the impact of online harm, and I would really appreciate if you could share some of how that's been for you.
Yeah, sure. So I guess looking at it from more of a kind of individual level, a few years ago now, I was the victim of a targeted harassment campaign due to my anti-racism activist work, which is not an uncommon experience, particularly for women of colour and Indigenous women. For my experience, what it looked like was hours and hours of content made about me, people I knew, family members of mine. A lot of the content existed on platforms where I wouldn't really expect to get any kind of good results in terms of removing the content, like Telegram. However, a lot of the content also existed on really mainstream platforms that New Zealanders use every day, like YouTube. In terms of that content, it kind of, like Chris was saying, it recycled the same old tropes that we hear over and over again, in terms of me not being a real Māori, questioning my whakapapa, all the way to kind of global things that we see quite often, of me being like a Satanist or things like that. There was lots of threats of violence, whether that be requests for their audience to harass me further, either online or physically. In terms of how that impacted me and my whānau, at the time, my employer had to be notified because my place of employment was doxed. Luckily, I had a very understanding employer, which I know is not the experience of everyone, which allowed me to put in some really robust safety precautions, both at work and at home. My whānau actually had an escape plan from our house in case we were ever followed home one day. And I think that probably speaks to the real life impacts at like an individual level of online harm, especially when it's allowed and enabled by platforms, as we've discussed, to grow and surge into this full harassment campaign.
Thanks, Anna. Just aroha. Yeah. And we know that this harm isn't just on social media. We know there's gaming websites and other sites, sometimes retail sites like Amazon and so on, wherever there's space for people to interact, that kind of abuse and harassment can exist. So I'm going to go to each of you now. I'm starting with Ana to say what would have helped and what would you like to see in place, because people would say, for example, for the things that you were suffering, that there's NetSafe, or you could go to the police, or, you know, that we already have laws in place. So, yeah, what would you like to see that isn't there at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that I noticed was that although we do have some laws in place, like the Harmful Digital Communications Act, and some bodies like NetSafe, it's not a system that particularly at this stage of technology is very responsive to how tech is working. So I did go to the police and they informed me that they didn't feel they could do anything until it progressed to real world violence. And I did go to NetSafe as well at the time, and they offered mediation between myself and the content creators, which was not something I was willing to engage with. I think that that's kind of an issue in terms of where users within a jurisdiction can engage with bodies set up by the government that should be enabled to deal with this kind of harm. I think another aspect that I want to touch on is there was no real access, I felt, for me as a user of a platform like YouTube to easily engage with the platform so that they could review or remove content. A lot of the times it required me to kind of gather my community up on Twitter at the time, and go, can we all report this particular video because it's really harmful for me and my family? That takes effort from me to have to do that, and it takes my community to have to step out from their very busy lives to report content that really should be picked up by the platform, or that should be an easier avenue for me to engage with the platform as the user, to request that platform is at least the content is at least reviewed or removed. I think that kind of easy access for reporting is getting worse and worse these days.
Thank you. I'll go to you, Chris, in terms of the issues that you talked about. What would have helped, do you think?
I think Anna's touched on most of them, but I think the kind of my experience in the past has kind of been that NetSafe will send you to the police and police will send you back to NetSafe, and you'll go round and round in a circle, and neither of them particularly can or have the capacity or the will to do anything about this. I think a lot of it is, like Anna said, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. They'll investigate after the violence has happened rather than before preventing it and those kind of things. I think also that point around reporting is really nascent. I think the worst thing, and kind of what Anna had to do, and what I'd still have to do now, or Anna would have to do now, is we have to get our friends and our whānau to see this content, to view it as well, to report it. Like they can't, we have to subject kind of people to viewing what we've seen in order to get it taken down. We have to get them to report it. And so by doing that, we end up, spreading the trauma and making them have to see some of the worst of human output as well, just because that's the only way we can kind of action it at the moment. So I'd second Ana around that. Easier ways to report, and less of making the victim do all of the heavy lifting to take something down. It should be on the content creator. It should be on their end more to prove that they aren't being harmful, rather than on the victim's end to prove that they are being harmful. However that may be done. I'm not, I don't really have a good answer for what else would have helped. I think but I think certainly more responsive platforms, and ways of getting stuff taken down that doesn't involve, like Ana said, mobilizing communities to go and report it, because that becomes an arms race, and whoever has the biggest community, which often isn't the minorities, can end up winning that arms race. So it's not a particularly good way to do it.
Thanks, Chris. And over to you, Jodan, in terms of what you were experiencing with the voice and the harm there, like what would have helped at that time?
Let me think. Where do I start? How long have I got? It's a really big question. Obviously, the ultimate goal is a lot of platform accountability, because they're just not accountable at all. But for us, I guess there was so many different layers too. I think after the moment I told you through 2020, when newsrooms had this racial reckoning, they called it, across the world, it really exposed how white they all were, and I would argue still are. I mean, you've got in Australia, you have a couple of really good pockets. The ABC has a properly funded Indigenous affairs team where they have they have Aboriginal women that are the editors, and they have a lot of support staff around groups of people, and they're not employed one out, which obviously we know causes a lot of harm. And same at the Guardian Australia, they built their own little circle there, as opposed to having just the Indigenous affairs correspondent as well. But there's actually been a pretty interesting piece of work that came out a couple of years back after Stan Grant quit the ABC and Q&A, after he was asked to go on the coverage of the King's coronation, and he got his family were threatened, and there was just waves of online abuse coming his way. So after that, they did a report called "Listen Loudly, Act Strongly," that we have the link to here, and they looked into the systems and processes within the institution, about how they handled racism towards their staff. Now, there's a long list of things there. On the recommendations, you could probably ask any Aboriginal staff member, and they'd say, "Yeah, no shit, we knew this all along." But I think it's a really tough thing for these big institutions to reckon with, because, as I mentioned, they've always been so white. All their executives just haven't experienced the cultural diversity and who we are as people. So we really need to change that up. We really need to get more diversity into executive levels and decision-making places as well. We move beyond representation. But linking it back to what I'm doing now, I guess, at university, is we need to be training the next generations of communication professionals who are going into industry to bringing these things into the course material, so they have an awareness early. They shouldn't just be coming to media courses and learning about the history of communication and just how to redo a press release into a story and things like that. They're learning those practical skills because universities have that graduate-ready attribute, but they need to be culturally responsive as well, and they need to be learning courses like mine, where you can bring in what we've gone through in the last 10 years. So look, there's other layers too that we could get through. So maybe a couple of things there. That was a wish list looking back. I guess the voice referendum was really, really unique. It was the first referendum or large-scale event like that in the era of social media. So I think no one was prepared at all. And that's what really exacerbated the harm, that everyone was chasing their tail on the run in terms of support.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because we know, for example, that women reporters have been getting abuse for years and years, and so they had a case there, like an example there that they could have worked on to develop their systems that would have supported your communities as well. But clearly that didn't happen. Okay, so I want to move to a more systems view. And so, Jodan, you did mention holding the platforms liable. Because, yeah, one area that we've traversed is that the reporting systems aren't working and where the burden lies. But there's also that whole issue of the way the platforms are designed and the way that content is being promoted and so on. So my question was really, when you're looking at a systems view and how is it not working for Indigenous people, and how would you impact the system? And I think that ties into a question that we got from the participants, which is what would be better proposed functionality for reporting content. But I'm wondering whether, that question would be answered better in terms of looking at a systems approach. So I'm going to go to you first, Jodan.
Look, without simplifying the question, why is the current system not working for Indigenous communities? That's because all the systems aren't made for us. In a nutshell, personally, I think we need to make our own. We're always playing catch up, and we're doing really well. We're very resilient, and we are, bending these systems and all the new technologies to our will where we can. But yeah, they're not set up for us to succeed. And I think that, look, you mentioned as part of the hardware campaign, algorithmic transparency. I think that's a massive one. Um, but it's such a nuanced problem. Like if you look at the field of psychology, the negativity bias, where everyone's drawn to the drama, the negativity within ourselves, and we click yes on all these things, and we want to read all these comments from afar with the popcorn, like the meme. And so we kept getting curated feeds in algorithms as well. I find that really tough, a thing to overcome. But you've also got all these large media companies too, dressing their covertly racist opinions as valid opinion they can share, and they're flooding YouTube and the algorithm with all these short form videos too. But I think at the end of the day, the system's not working because they're not made for us, and I don't think well, for my country, for example, there's enough political will to really take it on.
So just to delve into that more, so if it was made for you, can you think of any features or any things that you'd like to have that would work better?
Well, we should probably go back to why this social media systems, for an example, were made, and they were made to connect and share with each other. I guess I wouldn't say respectfully, but in a nutshell, that's what it was for, to be able to talk to your friends a lot more easily and form groups and share your commonalities and the things you like. Whereas it seems to have turned the other way. And once like we mentioned earlier, engagement is monetized and sold to advertisers, it's pretty clear that all the negative content's what's going to fly. So rebuilding from the ground up, having systems and algorithms in place that will delete this negative content immediately that's not called for, instead of people having to do it themselves, like we mentioned. But I guess, yeah, all systems we should be making should be made upon our worldviews, which is connecting with each other and looking after each other and looking after country. And the advancing technology is not like that at all. It's just hyper capitalist, and ultimately just serves the shareholders and whoever gets the money. So we could talk on
Yeah.
that forever if you want to, but we might have to let someone else in.
Yeah, no, all good. I'm all for challenging capitalism. Just a reminder that people are not able to speak if you're a participant, and if you've got questions or comments, please do use the Q&A function. We'd love to be getting any questions that you have through. I'll pass over to you, Ana, to answer that question.
I also had capitalism in my notes for this question. I think and maybe this isn't true, and I wasn't around in the early days of the internet, so I'm not sure, but I have this perception that in the early days of the internet, it was really based on the needs of the user, and stuff was being made to solve problems for people. Whether that's just me looking back at history with rose-colored glasses, I'm not sure. But I think that there has been a drastic shift in the last decade or so, where we've gone from tech being there to fix problems for users to tech being there to make money for a very small group of people. And I think that shift has really led to none of these systems working for people, and by extension, none of these systems working for Indigenous people. In capitalism, there needs to be some kind of loser, and often that intersects with gender and race as well. So I think that's why we see certain communities being so disadvantaged by tech and platforms specifically these days. I think that the shift in the way users engage with technology is also leaning more towards capitalist use of tech as opposed to people using tech to fix our problems. So by that I mean we're moving away from websites, we're moving away from making our own little spaces on the internet to we're going in these multinational billion-dollar platforms where they exist to make money. I think the business model of big tech is something that will, unless that's disrupted, it will continue to impact Indigenous communities the way it does because that business model is so flawed and does not at all centre the user, which I think is something when we talk about regulation and legislation needs to be the focus.
So just a follow-up question, when you talk about disrupting, how might we start disrupting some of that?
I think that there's a few methods. So we saw the massive shift of the user base of Twitter when it moved to Elon Musk's ownership. I think that us walking with our feet is a fair way of disrupting. I think we will see more and more of that, particularly in the younger generations. We're seeing them want to disengage with technology because they've spent their whole life on it, and can really see the harms. I think that that's a potential avenue. I think that another potential avenue is legislation and regulation. I think that that's super valid and necessary. And I think that a third avenue, like Jodan was saying, is the creation of our own platforms, technology, spaces. I think that could, I'm not talking about in terms of fragmenting the internet. I'm talking about in terms of building our own infrastructure that can sit within current existing infrastructure just to make spaces that are purpose-built for community. I think that each of those three things needs to happen at the same time to have the most effective impact.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was just recalling a conversation last week where there were some of us who were like, why can't we have a New Zealand-based cloud? We'd immediately shift all our files if we had an option of one that we had sovereignty over and, that protected people rather than mind their files. Chris, I'll go over to you.
So sadly, I am old enough to have been around when the internet was starting, and Anna's right. There was capitalism creeping even back then, but it's certainly nowhere to the hyper-capitalism that we are at this point. And it was most of the nodes and places of the internet were being built by universities and built by research institutions to share data, to create connections, to advance scientific knowledge, not to sell you products or to sell you advertising. One of my good friends, Tom, always says the internet used to be a wonderful place, but now it's just 4 websites, Facebook, Google, those kind of things. It's this compression of what was a distributed and federated and kind of not egalitarian, but at least not controlled by 4 major companies. It's the internet of this day is very different to the internet of the early 90s when I was starting to play around with it. And kind of touching back to both what Jodan and Ana were talking about, I think, at least speaking as Māori, we're always there's kind of 2 ways I work at any given time. I'm either doing harm minimization, which is where I'm working in the Pākehā system to try and make it less shit, and then we work over in the mana motuhake area in the Māori space to try and build good stuff. And I don't think we can build good stuff inside the hyper-capitalist Pākehā kind of Westminster democracy system that we have now. We can minimize the harm, and that's where regulations, that's where holding platforms accountable, those kind of things, they sit in that, making it slightly less bad. But I think to actually make it good, as both Ana and Jodan talked about, we need to build our own. And in Te Ao Māori, we've always had ways of engaging. We've had ways of dealing with conflict. We've had ways of having difficult discussions. We've got a whole lot of tikanga and kawa built around that. Just because we're doing it digitally doesn't mean we have to reinvent the ways that we work as people. So if we build platforms based around kind of our positions of manaakitanga and aroha, those kind of things, then it's easier to, if this is not mana and heartsing's the wrong word, but if this content is takahi someone's mana, then it's easy to remove that. That's not the way that works. There's a time and a place for that. If you're on the marae atia, so you can have certain spaces that can be set aside for those hard discussions, other spaces where you can be whānau together. And I think we know how to do that. We've navigated conflict for generations, for centuries, and we know how to do that. We can do that same thing online. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just take our ways of being and move them digitally. And that's kind of the way I think about Māori data sovereignty and looking after data and those kind of things. We always had ways of protecting knowledge, protecting who it was transmitted to, protecting the people that it was transmitted to. Just because it's digital doesn't mean that we have to reinvent that. So I think there's a whole lot of, we know how to do it. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders have been doing it for 40, 60,000 years. They know how to do it too. So I think there's a lot of knowledge there that we can use. And for Aboriginal Australian, it's not just dialects like we have here in Aotearoa. Whole different language families, whole different languages. They've managed to navigate that for centuries and centuries, for millennia. And so we know how to do it. We just need to be, I'd just love for people to give us the money and get out of the way. That would be my ideal solution to this.
Yes, that would be lovely. And the interesting thing is when you say, that everyone's now on 4 websites, the thing is that they just buy up anything that's good. We were on WhatsApp and it was great, and now it's what it is. We were on Instagram, it was wonderful, and now it's part of the fold. And so I think one of the challenges not only is getting the money, but how do we retain ownership and not give it all up to these big enterprises that are so focused on money. And Ana, when you were talking, I was reminded of Cory Doctorow's enshittification kōrero, which is basically his word to describe what that process of capitalism and focusing on the money rather than the users. Given that our campaign, the No Harm campaign, is about better regulation, and I totally take what you're saying, Chris, that it is a process of making Pākehā world less shitty. Are there any things that you think we should be more careful about when we're thinking about regulation or legislation? And I'm going to start with you, Ana.
Sure. My favorite topic. So many things to be careful about. I think I'll just talk about 2 things that I think are things that I say all the time. So I'll just say them again because I do think that they're really vital. So one thing that we've talked about a bit already is centering the user. So centering the user's needs in any kind of legislation or regulation of the digital space. I think that needs to be really carefully balanced with something that I'm seeing a bit of a trend in terms of regulation globally, which is centering the user by burdening them with more work to do. So I'm thinking a lot about a lot of the age gating legislation we're seeing globally in terms of like the under 16 ban here in New Zealand. There's this shift in regulation, and in terms of the power dynamics that are at play with the user and the platform, the power is very much with the platform at the moment. The only way I talk to my whānau at the moment is not through text message, it's all through platforms. And I love the ability to talk to my whānau and engage with them in that way. The way I engage with my community is through social media. I would prefer to not leave these platforms because they have become such an important part of how we exist in today's digital world. So to put more burden through regulation on the user is it's not something that makes sense to me in terms of the power imbalance that we see already existing. I would much prefer we place the burden on needing to do things, needing to be accountable on the multi-billion-dollar platforms that are making unimaginable amounts of money every year. The second thing, which I say every time I talk to government, and feel like I should just maybe get tattooed across my forehead at this point, is it's really vital that any regulation of the digital space is technologically sound. And there's a real tension in terms of the pace of government, which is very slow, and then the pace of technology, which is very fast, and needing people writing legislation, policymakers, and politicians to know what they're talking about and know how it works. So, the three most important things I would say in technically sound regulation of the online space is making sure you're selecting the right part of the stack at a very like basic level, which most policymakers don't even know what I'm saying when I say that. So that's a big challenge. The right technical and regulatory tool to achieve the right impact without unintended extra impacts, which is what we see all the time when government attempts to write legislation that impacts the technical space. And I don't expect policymakers or politicians to have this expertise, but I certainly do expect them to go and talk to the people who understand the tech so that they can, at the start of thinking about legislation, have that knowledge up front. I would say those centering the user but not burdening them, and please know the tech that you're trying to legislate would be my top two.
Thank you. Thanks, Ana. Chris, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I think also one thing to be aware of is that when we're shaping these regulations, we have to be careful that they can't in turn be used as a weapon against us. So I think Queensland's just passed in my opinion, a really draconian law around people who protest for Palestine. You can't say from the river to the sea. You can get arrested for that now. And so when we're being careful about regulating speech or online expressions, we have to be careful that whatever we craft can't be in turn used as a weapon to silence us, to silent dissent, to silent those kind of things, because as I mentioned before, we don't have the numbers on our side. So what often what we see in not almost all, but a lot of legislation, if you look at even the legislation that was used to invade Te Urawera, anti-terrorist kind of stuff, it ends up being used against Māori instead of the white supremacist groups that are the actual terrorists in this country. So and I don't know how to solve that. That's not my sphere of expertise, but there are people who understand this kind of stuff and who can craft policy and legislation to make it in a way that restricts its ability to be used against minorities in that kind of silencing manner. Just like Ana said, I don't expect the politicians to know that, but I expect them to consult with the people who do, just like they should do in the tech space. I think that's my main worry. There's always a balancing kind of thing with it, because I'm not a free speech abolitionist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that in restricting it, you have to be careful how you do that, because the powers that be generally make rules that enforce their power, not they generally don't make regulations that reduce their influence or reduce the people who fund them's influence. So sometimes it's a case of be careful what you wish for in those kind of spaces. I think that's all for me.
Thanks, Chris. And we are definitely seeing some worrying stuff in Australia, like an organisation that expressed grief over the death of Iran's leader, and regardless what you think of him, lost all their government funding, not being able to say global intifada and things like that. It's feeling really harsh over there, Jodan. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, there's a lot happening lately, ever since what happened at Bondi Beach. Um, yeah, I think not working in that space, there isn't a great deal I can add much to what Chris said, but I mean, I've really trying to keep my finger on the pulse with the way tech is going because obviously, I'm interested in data sovereignty movements too, and I can see the spreading of the data colonialism project and seeing how everything about us is collected and used against us as it is, and now we've got the layer of the progressive generative artificial intelligences that are coming out too, which have actually can be really, really concerning because the way that they're being talked about being used over in the United States and things like that. So I think, yeah, the biggest thing to be mindful of is like what Chris said, is there is a real big chance of even more surveillance happening too, if there's legislation that's built to serve those in power coming into action in countries. That'll be used extensively to watch almost everything we do. I think that's a key one there. And I mean, there's a really dangerous company across the world, that have stolen one of my favorite things from Lord of the Rings, a certain little ball that Saruman uses, and that's their name. So you can probably articulate what they're trying to do with their business. So I think that's something we need to really watch out for. And it's a really hard thing too, because at the end of the day, I believe there should be so much more accountability on the people making these platforms, and the governments are a part of that, so they need to really step up.
Thank you. So we're getting a few questions come through. So just before I do put the questions to you all, is there any final thoughts you want to share before we go into Q&A? Anything? No?
I could just quickly mention that and Anna's point before too is what I'm seeing is the rate technology is developing now. It is just too quick for anyone to even know what these things can do, let alone put it in legislation and policies to keep up with them. So I think that's the next thing. You've obviously got a lot of racist people online spewing hate, but you've also got the ability to generate many things immediately in all sort of forms, all modes, imagery, video content as well that can be, that people can actually get automated artificial intelligence systems to create and put up there. And we're seeing it now in the news industry with automated websites that are coming up and bringing all the traffic with news stories that seem okay, but they're actually really, really wrong. So I think the ability to create so much content at the speed of light can cause a lot of harm too. So I haven't got the answer for that, but yeah, the way regulation works, it's not keeping up with that at all.
Yeah, I do agree with that. That we're way behind, and so I'm wondering whether it's better to move to a principles-based kind of regulatory system like the Privacy Act, which has principles, or the Bill of Rights Act, rather than trying to regulate particular forms or types of technology. And I do know the Helen Clark Foundation did some work on that a few years ago, which they called the Christchurch Principles. But okay, let's move into the Q&A. So there's a couple of questions here around the better functionality for reporting content. I think you'll have spoken to that a little bit, but if you wanted any further comment, and I think the next question here is also related in terms of what we need to do to convince or force the platforms to provide human oversight to the algorithm and also human help or appeal on request. So does anyone have some initial thoughts on that? Did you want to go first? Yeah, Ana?
Yeah, I can. I think in terms of functionality for reporting content, I think there was a massive like visible felt shift as soon as the content moderation of a lot of these big platforms kind of dissolved when Trump got reelected. I think that as a user, I really felt what that meant from the user end. So I think that localized content moderation in each jurisdiction, or at least grouped jurisdictions, is invaluable as someone who's reporting potentially harmful content. In terms of the human oversight to algorithms, a part of me questions whether the horse might have bolted with this one, especially the way in which AI is used in algorithms nowadays, particularly for those big players. I know that algorithm transparency was one of the results of the inquiry into online harm for youth. I would be interested, I'm not an AI expert by any means, but I would be interested to know what that actually looks like from the back end in terms of these platforms and how much any of that algorithm decision making is really readable from a human perspective. But I certainly think that it can't hurt to get a peek under the hood.
Yeah, I did write a paper a few years ago now on algorithmic audits, and it's like it's not so much transparency of the code, but more transparency of the impact. And I'm not a tech head and also not expert on these things, but what I did do is use the model and principles of financial audits and show how you could use those principles and models to maintain, IP and all of those things, and yet still hold platforms accountable. But of course, not having the technical background, I don't know how to make that happen technologically. I'll go to you, Chris, if you wanted to answer those questions or not.
I think you've raised a good point, Anna, around the auditability. Some of these algorithms now, you'd be hard pressed to anyone tell you how it's actually working. But there are tools themselves. So there are some algorithms that can evaluate code bases for bias. And there are tools that can evaluate data sets for bias. And so it doesn't necessarily need to always be human oversight. There should be always a human on the end of that chain. But I think we can use some of the tools against the tools, for want of a better word. But we can evaluate. And you certainly, even if you can't peer under the hood, you can do what they used to call black boxing, where you provide the same input and you see which outputs you get. And you can figure out kind of how the algorithm works by manipulating the inputs and seeing how the outputs change. At least not so much in the generative space, because that's not non-deterministic most of the time. It's just going to make up whatever it makes up. But certainly in terms of those kind of algorithms that are increasingly be used in government spaces to decide who gets things like benefits, to decide who gets citizenship, to decide all sorts of things, those algorithms at least should be fully audited and fully transparent, even if we can't do it with some of these really complicated generative ones.
Jodan, did you want to add anything? Don't have to if you don't want to. No, you're good. I'll just share a couple of comments. Someone who said, great kōrero te ao Māori has always adapted through tikanga. We cannot go wrong, which, yeah, and I really love that answer from you, Chris. And someone, Dr. Lucas Yu, who's saying that he's followed the policy debate since last year's committee hearing. Protecting youth is vital, but weak platform accountability must be balanced against freedom of expression risks from heavy state regulation. And I think, we've covered that we're all well aware where and how regulation gets used, and it's usually most heavily against minority communities. and some comments about the flawed under 16 social media ban, which we personally aren't supporting at Tāhono Trust, and I know that Amnesty aren't. But, have heard from people that work in the child sexual abuse space and why they want to see that in terms of the amount of exposure kids are getting to adults who are not known to them, which is a real risk. So it's a difficult topic. And in terms of an independent regulator needing scrutiny and who sets the standards, I think the E-Safety Commission is a good model there, where they have a really strong consultative model to set codes, where they talk to industry and community and so on. And definitely agree with being free from political interference. Like, the whole regulatory framework needs to be protected from that. There's a question here. Let me just pop that. The US government is pushing for a global rule change under the Cloud Act that says if a US company owns the platform where data is stored, that data belongs to the US legal system, even if the servers are physically located in another country, and what your views are on that. And also, we have heard through various channels that some of these platforms are handing over our data to the US administration before being asked to do so. So they're voluntarily handing over that data. So I'll start with you, Chris, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, the Cloud Act itself's not new. It's from 2018, and so this has kind of been ongoing for a long time. So what essentially happened was Microsoft had some emails on some servers in Dublin, in Ireland, and the US government wanted them. They went through what was the law at that stage. They fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the government lost. And so then they passed a law saying that if the company is US owned, US laws apply to it no matter where it is. Wherever the data is physically located doesn't matter. It's still logically under US laws. So that's been kind of the case for Azure, AWS, Google, Microsoft, Apple, any of these big platforms. Essentially, doesn't matter if they build a data center in Aotearoa, all they do here is use our water and our power, but it still comes under the US Act, US legislation under the Cloud Law Act. That's not so bad. Well, it's bad, but it gets worse when you couple that with things like the Patriot Act, which allows for subpoena-less or warrantless access to information. And then you can couple it with FISA, which is the Foreign Intelligence Securities Act, which again allows security agencies to ask or demand from these platforms data. And one of the things they can't tell you is that they have given this data away. So while you might get transparency reports from organizations like Microsoft, and you might say, oh, that's not so bad, they can't tell you about all the ones that are obtained under the Patriot or the FISA Act, because that's part of the Act. It says you're not allowed to tell users that you've accessed this data. So we don't know how big this problem is. Anecdotally, we know that they are giving away data, but we can't, again, we don't have transparency, we don't have auditability. They could still get to that data under a New Zealand company. Say you use Catalyst Cloud, wholly New Zealand-owned company, they still could get to that data, but they would have to go through the New Zealand court systems, or they'd have to use something like the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime with the reciprocal sharing of arrangements that way. But at least there would be some transparency, some audit trail. So things like the Cloud Act are a real challenge for data sovereignty movements, because you can be doing all the right things, except for putting your data in one of these US-owned companies means that your policies can be correct, but you still can't really exert your sovereignty because you have no control over who actually has data, access to that data. It also interacts really weirdly with things like GDPR and stuff, so it becomes a minefield of who has the most expensive lawyers.
It is, and I was just reading something today about the way AI is interfacing with Ring cameras that people have in their neighborhoods in the US, and collating all that data and synthesizing it, and like the ways that we're actually being surveilled is quite scary at the moment. Jodan, did you want to add anything on that?
Uh, can't really say anything further than what Chris knows. He knows a lot more about that than me. But look, just reading the comment from Nick there, yeah, that doesn't sound good at all, to be honest.
Yeah,
Um,
that's,
yeah, and the comments on surveillance, I mean, that's only what we know too. That, you don't even know. People be doing a lot more at the moment with all our data, and we just have no idea. There's just not enough transparency at all. And will there ever be? Does big tech care about us?
yeah,
Or they just care about the race to the general intelligence robot?
yeah. Anna, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I might just add, I think it's a really interesting discussion in terms of the shift geopolitically that we're seeing in certain jurisdictions where they are becoming so close with the tech bros. I don't think that this act is likely to pass, but there is an act called the Granite Act, which is also really interesting if people want to have a look at that. It would enable, I mean, the legality of this, like Chris was saying with the Cloud Act, it's all very confusing and none of it's been tested in law and who knows what will happen. But it's basically saying that any jurisdiction that tries to fine or regulate through financial means, a US based company would be liable in their civil court, which one would argue doesn't have jurisdiction in other countries. But I think it's an illustration of the way in which really big players in the digital space, like the States, are moving to this really symbiotic relationship with the capitalism of tech that we were talking about before.
Yeah. Look, time is getting on, so I will just put in this last question and then we will wrap up. So, someone who is effectively asking which platforms would align with their values and support what they care about. Like, do we have any? It's a bit of a difficult question because we're not being paid by anyone, by the way. That is techie. But are there, Chris, I'll go to you first. Are there any platforms that you would recommend that are values aligned?
Platforms, I guess probably the closest would be some of the Mastodon ones because it's a federated way of doing. And so Cloud Island, which is one hosted here in Aotearoa, I think they have pretty decent value alignment. I think, but again, that's a small part, and the problem there is like Twitter used to be awesome in that I talk to Indigenous people all around the world, and you just don't get that on these smaller platforms. So you often trade that kind of reach, I guess, for less racism. So it's not a trade-off anyone should have to make. I can't think of any other. I know there was a Māori couple were trying to build, I forget the name of it, but a kind of a Facebook equivalent. I don't know where that's at. I suspect something like that could be kind of cool. It just depends whether they have the moderation and the systems in place behind it to to deal with the inevitable encroachment into it.
Yeah,
So yeah,
because I'm also on Mastodon. I'm on Mastodon.nz, but it's relying on volunteer moderators, and that doesn't work at volume. Anna, did you have any particular tech that you support?
I think in terms of, so if you're thinking like messaging, I would go Signal over WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. If you're wanting social media, I would do Mastodon or Blue Sky. Otherwise, build a website. That's great. Website's awesome. Start a newsletter. I think email your whānau is also really useful. There are very few platforms out there that I would say are really ethical though.
Are we going back to Yahoo groups? No, please. Jodan, anything that you like in terms of values aligned platforms?
No, not really. I mean, I'm just really conscious of like what I do say and put into certain platforms as well. But also, we've all got a smartphone too. That's picking up absolutely everything we're doing. So I mean, yeah, you can't get away from it. We've got to try and find the best ways we can bend things to what we want, and find our own spaces.
Yeah, I know. I've been through the process of seeing which apps on my phone I can delete, knowing how much data they collect, and there's a growing move to go back to non-smartphones, which is quite interesting, which ties into what you were saying, Ana, about the new generation pulling back from tech. Just one last comment. There's a group known as You for Apartheid formed by Microsoft workers who are against their labour being used in war crimes and sometimes against their own people. And they're saying that's an amazing group, and they're the only New Zealand-based member, though they aren't a Microsoft worker. So encouraging people to join that, as You Are for Apartheid. So I think that is us. I just really want to thank all of our panelists. Really amazing to have you on, and it's been a beautiful conversation on a really ugly topic, unfortunately. And I do also want to shout out to our tech support here, Storm, who's been working in the background to make this webinar happen. It has been recorded, so it'll be available online, so please do share it. We'll be putting it on our website and our socials, so please do share it around for people that were able to make it at this time. I just want to finish with a closing karakia. Kua mutu o mātou mahi, mō tēnei wā, mana kitia mai tātou katoa, o mātou hua, o mātou whānau, ai o ki te aorangi, tihei Māori ora. Thank you all. Ka kite anō.